have some time for questions? We have a little bit of time. Wonderful. So we have some time for questions. Anything and everything, whatever you'd like to talk about. My contact info was just up there. TK Speaks is my Twitter handle. TK@Delphi Group is my email. I'd love to continue the discussion with any and all of you at any point in time. But if there are questions, I guess there are microphones. Should people just step up to the microphone? Is that the way it works? So just step up to the microphone and talk to me, please. You know, I'll share with you while you're doing that, I'll share with you one really interesting thing. When I talk to younger kids a lot, which I love to do, the one thing that we're very deficient in the US when it comes to innovation is mentoring. So I'll ask these kids, I'll say, how many of you have a mentor? And really does a hand go up. So I would challenge you with something today that I think is really important, and that is become a mentor. Because the best way to innovate is to teach these kids some of the skills that you have learned in the course of your life, and to encourage them with the skills that they're going to be learning as well. We don't do enough mentoring in this industry, and we need to do more of it. Just the challenge that I put out there. Yes, sir.
Yes, excellent talk, Tom. Question that I have is, do we think that spending more time understanding how the brain works, and the fact that there's a new body of research, no, it's not that new, about neuroplasticity, where our generation was taught to believe that a child's brain stops developing around the age of 3 or 4, and
right.
We know that in effect that that's not true. Do we think that understanding the learning process will help us to accelerate some of your futuristic ideas about where innovation will go?
That is a wonderful question. So let me just touch on a few points there. You know, we have these misconceptions about the way that the brain works. You know, we believe that we only use 10% of our brain, that our brains are fully formed at age 3 or 4, and, you know, they're set in stone at that point. And while there's always some truth to all of this mythology, I think by and large we have to break free of it. Yes, I work with young kids a lot. I'm part of a nationwide program called Destination Imagination, which tries to teach creativity to kids, and I do see it myself. I work with very young kids, preschoolers, I work with grade schoolers, adolescents, high schoolers, and you do see as they get older, if they haven't been exposed to creative problem solving, it's tougher for them. It's not impossible, it's just tougher. And the same thing applies to adults. I've done corporate training, we're doing training around with Intel, across all of Intel, on creativity and innovation. It's tough, because we believe as adults that brainstorming is enough, and if we're smart enough, then brainstorming is the only tool we need. That's kind of like saying, you know, a pair of vice grips you can take apart an aircraft engine and put it back together again. In principle, yeah, you probably could, right? In practice, no, that's not the case. So it is tough, and we need to learn some tools. So I think we have to let go of some of those assumptions. I think that it's clear, in my experience, that creativity can be taught if it's taught as a process, not just as a rah-rah, kumbaya exercise, but a real process. There are tools that you can use to be more creative. And ultimately, it's a matter of, you know, not are you creative or are you not, but how are you creative? And taking that how and learning how to apply that in practical situations. So I don't buy into a lot of the mythology about the human brain and how stuck we are. I think with effort and patience and the right tools, most often that can be changed. But the bottom line is, you know, it's all a bunch of malarkey. We've got to change it. I mean, otherwise we're stuck. We're stuck here, and none of us want to be stuck here. I mean, there are problems that we've got to solve. And they're big problems, and we're going to have to get more creative about how we address them. So, you know, we've got to rise to the occasion. Yes?
Hi there. I'm asking this question on behalf of somebody who couldn't be here, but who's following the Twitter stream on the tag thing hashtag. And his question is, who introduced you to Twitter? And my question is, what was your first reaction, and has that changed over time?
I missed the first part of that. I got the reaction and changed over time, but I missed the first part. I'm sorry.
Who introduced you to Twitter?
I'm still not getting that. I'm sorry.
Who introduced you to Twitter?
Oh, who introduced me to Twitter?
Uh-huh.
Who introduced me to Twitter? That's a really good question. You know, I don't recall who introduced me to Twitter. It was not my kids. I mean, that I know. It was not my kids. You know, part of what probably happened is, as is often the case with most of my experiences, I tend to stumble across a lot of this. And here's the advice I would give to everyone, is that because someone hasn't made the recommendation, you discount it. You say, if it's not in my circle, in my sphere of influence, then it can't be important. It's not on my radar scope. So I dedicate a certain amount of my time to exploring stuff that I have just stumbled across. And I find, amazingly enough, that that does lead me periodically down some fruitful paths, like Twitter. That's probably the way I found out about Twitter. It probably wasn't even an introduction. I probably did stumble across it, more than likely. Now, given that, it was kind of like stumbling across, cocaine. I mean, I got addicted to it, and I would spend literally hours a day on Twitter trying to figure it out. But it was like banging my head up against the wall because I couldn't get it. And then finally, dawn broke one day, and I realized there was nothing to get. It was just about serendipity. And occasionally, it had some value. Mostly, it didn't. But the occasional value was worth it. And that's kind of life, isn't it? I mean, we pursue a lot of things that result in nothing, and occasionally something results in, a big success. And you say, hey, I did the right stuff. No, most of what you did was the wrong stuff. But you did one right thing. And I think it's the same way with social networking. It's mostly serendipity. The biggest benefit to me today of using Twitter is getting introduced to people that otherwise I would not normally come in contact with. And I've been introduced to a lot of entrepreneurs mostly that have very good ideas that I would never find out about if I wasn't using Twitter. That's been the benefit to me so far of Twitter. Thank you for the question. Yes?
Hey, my company is integrating social networking with security operations. And one of the questions that I had with you was, in the past with all of my inventions I've ever had, companies have always measured its success by immediate success or probability of being successful by looking at the industry, taking probabilities, taking surveys, and saying, does this work or not?
Sure.
And obviously with your model, that kind of stuff will give you not the right answers a lot of times. And it's those type of inventions that years later people go, oh, wow, that would have been great, right? It's like the dead authors that don't get credit, right?
Yeah.
So in the same way now, being in a different situation, being as an owner of a company, what I'd like to understand is, with the music industry, they've got those machines they can run on their ideas that say, this is not popular now, but it will be 5 years from now. What kind of tools do we have, since we can't trust probabilities in such a volatile industry, to actually know what the behavior is going to look like, or what, where the predictive models are going to go in terms of the behavior and what we're innovating towards?
That's a wonderful question. It really is, because it cuts to the heart of the matter. If you can't predict the future, if you can't factor uncertainty into a business model, then how do you rationalize the business model? How do you rationalize it with investors, with stockholders, with employees, whatever the case might be? It's a very tough question, but I'll give you some insight. The first thing I would say is that if you look at, and again it becomes generational, how younger generations are answering that same question, it is very different than how you or I might answer it. They accept that there's a certain inherent value to things like social networking. They're not sure what that value is, but they accept that it's worth dedicating some piece of their life to it. And it's unquestioned. It's unquestioned. I think as that makes its way through the workforce, you will find that some of that inherent acceptance of value in serendipity is going to become greater. I mean, today we want to control a whole lot of what goes into an organization, into a business plan. I think we're going to find that there'll be much more tolerance for experimentation and for failure, which today there isn't. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, there are some methods out there, and one of the best, it's called the Delphi method, although it's not named after Delphi Group, after my company. It's been in existence long before that. It's really a measure of perception, where you ask the population at large, what do you think? And it's incredible how accurate those kinds of metrics can be around new technologies. Now, the key there is that you don't ask the marketplace what it wants, because all it knows is what it's already had. So we can't predict the future any better than you can. But you can, I think, start to trickle out technology the way Apple did with the iPod, the way the Flip was trickled out, and start to trickle it out in social media, in small circles of influencers, and see how they react. And you've never had that kind of a test bed. This is not a focus group, right? This is completely different than a focus group, because now you can test a product or a service in a way that before was completely unavailable to you. And it doesn't cost much to do it. So there are indicators, and people are starting to use social media as one of those key indicators to help identify the trajectory, how a behavior will change, and how the trajectory of a company or a product might change as a result. But it is the $64 million question. Very good question. Some insight, hopefully, that I've been able to give you there on how to address that. Yes? I'll go back. I think there are two mics there are more mics that I'm not seeing. I'm just seeing these two right here. So, yes, please.
Can you give us one recommendation on how we could move a solo organization into a more collaborative organization?
Is it a big organization or a small one?
Let's say medium size.
Medium size, thousands of people, hundreds of people?
Thousands.
Thousands of people. So one of the most important things to do in an organization, once you get beyond the few hundred people mark or so, is to get leadership to be the poster children of the behavior. If it doesn't start there, it will not become pervasive. It just won't happen in my experience. So you have to lobby the leaders to adopt a certain behavior. So I'll give you an example. Not too long ago, I was working with a large legal technology association, and the biggest problem they had was that they couldn't get their partners to understand, embrace, and apply social media. And all kinds of covert things were going on behind the scenes. People were trying to use Facebook and trying to use Twitter, and they were being shut down by the firewall and what have you in the organizations. A classic case of how if you don't get the partners to embrace the technology to some degree or to begin using it, it's never going to filter down through the rest of the organization. So my suggestion would be focus on leadership. Now, if you can't get leadership to begin to experiment and to create a role model for usage of social networking, for collaboration, and it's going to be a fool's journey. I apologize for the bluntness. That's just been my experience. I mean, I put that leadership video up there for a reason, because at the end of the day, if leadership doesn't get behind it, it's nearly impossible to get the behavior to change. Yes, sir.
Hello? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, I can.
Hi, Tom. Joe Wilson. As of yesterday, about a sixth of our economy got changed radically. Where do you see innovation helping out healthcare going forward?
Yeah, boy, that was, I mean, things did change radically, and in ways that we can't even begin to predict yesterday as a result of the healthcare reform bill being passed. A lot of work will be done, obviously, in the Senate to change it in ways that we can't even begin to predict and understand. But to your question about innovation, the inhibitors of innovation in the healthcare space, and let's leave insurance outside of it for just a minute, because that's a whole other segment, but within the healthcare space, have a lot to do with the fact that there is not enough process-based innovation going on in healthcare. And I'll tell you exactly what I'm referring to here. In my neck of the woods in Boston, we have a very large collection of hospitals called Partners Healthcare, Mass General Hospital, Brigham and Women's, a number of prestigious hospitals. They have a 100-person in-house organization called the RVL, the Research and Ventures Licensing Group, which I wrote about in the Innovation Zone, that is tasked with just bringing new ideas to market. Very few healthcare institutions have that kind of a capability. So what they rely on is the docs to come across an idea, to hook them up with some capital, to bring it to market. Very inefficient process. I mean, horribly inefficient process. So having an in-house process that has the lawyers, the venture people, the technicians, the business people that can create commercial value out of ideas is what's most lacking in the healthcare system from a device standpoint, from a technology, therapeutics, diagnostics standpoint. So I think we have to make much more of a process of innovation. The second thing, and if you had to really put me up against the wall, the biggest single problem we have in healthcare is the lack of advocacy. The patient should not be the advocate, and in many cases cannot be the advocate. So the patient puts up with technologies, procedures, methods that don't work because they're not in a position to advocate for themselves. We need to have someone in the healthcare system that acts as an advocate for the patient, that ties together all the separateness, the tremendous disjointedness of the healthcare system, and creates a process from that. The process is lacking, by and large, I think, in healthcare, both from the standpoint of creating new innovations and from the standpoint of caring for the patient. So a much more process-centric view around innovation and how we deliver healthcare services, I think, is going to be absolutely essential if we're going to make healthcare work long term.
Thanks.
Thank you. So one last question, I believe. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Tom, thank you so much. My name is
welcome.
Cal Ayer. I'm a cloud entrepreneur based here in Atlanta. And my question has to do with all the disruptive change that the internet has brought about. And now perhaps we're seeing the cloud, which could bring about a second wave of disruption. How do you think the traditional brick and mortar type enterprises, and I think you talked about Barnes & Noble versus Amazon.
Right.
And how do you think, if you were advising a CEO of one of those types of companies, one of those more traditional type companies, how would you suggest that they should cope with this disruptive change and come up with some counter strategies?
That's a tough question. It's a big question. So let me just try to nibble at it a little bit. I think that number one, I mean, you said it yourself, the advice I would give to a CEO is that you have to architect some degree of disruption within the organization. And what that means is you have to give people some latitude to fail periodically. So companies like 3M, like Google, they give you latitude to fail. There's a price for failure, but you have the latitude to do it. You can experience small failures. You can take a certain amount of your time, at 3M, 20% of your time, and dedicate it to non-essential activities, to experiment. And I think we all need that. So I would tell every CEO, make sure that, number one, you provide some latitude for failure, that you give people the opportunity to take some limited risk. Number two, and this is going to floor a lot of you, I would take all the doors off of all the offices. We talk about collaboration, but we work behind closed doors. This new generation is not working behind closed doors. Trust me on this. But we're so accustomed to it. Take all the doors off of all the offices. Force the interrupt. Force the interrupt. Disruption is not meant to be comfortable. Disruption is meant to be painful. And growth comes from that pain, from that disruption. So as a CEO, you've got to architect a certain amount of that disruption, that pain into your organization. Allow failure, take all the doors off of the offices. And look, the last thing is that if you really want a collaborative organization, you've got to set the tone as the leader. You have to be the chief collaborator of that organization. You have to illustrate what it means to collaborate through technology, through behaviors. And I think that perhaps is the most important calling of leadership, is to become that billboard for the role model, that billboard for the behaviors that are appropriate for that organization to move forward and to be innovative. Thank you very much.